The small estate of Lady Vivian Harbury lay just beyond the outskirts of Chilmorton Green. A picturesque village where the hedgerows were clipped precisely, the postmaster knew every resident by name, and gossip floated as freely as the late summer pollen. Yet for all its charm, there was something peculiar, some said unsettling, about the centerpiece of Lady Vivian's property, the Garden of Whispering Faces. It was no ordinary garden. Sculpted topiary busts, nearly 40 of them, lined the winding gravel walkways. Each one was shaped with extraordinary care, men and women contorted into expressions of quiet mirth, sorrow, surprise, or serene contemplation. Their leafy faces seemed to speak in the hush of evening breezes, their shadows long and strange in the lamplight. And it was there, among these silent green sentinels, that the village awoke to tragedy. On the evening in question, Lady Harbury hosted one of her regular soirees, gatherings of music, exquisite teas, and genteel conversation. The guests arrived in carefully chauffeured cars, their laughter bright beneath the bloom-draped veranda. Among them were Miss Cora Finch, the hostess's companion, nervous, meek, always glancing over her shoulder as though expecting to be called to task. Sir Julian Worthing, a widower of impeccable manners and an enigmatic smile. Mrs. Adelaide Mullen, a widow with a taste for dramatics and a keen eye for romantic entanglements. Dr. Percival Lenton, calm, collected, and observant, perhaps too observant. Lucian Harbury, Lady Vivian's nephew, handsome, restless, and rumoured to be desperately in debt. Beatrice Pym, a young sculptor with bright eyes and the self-assurance of someone whose talent has recently been recognized. They mingled beneath lanterns shaped like paper lilies, the conversation glittering as brightly as the crystal glasses in their hands. Lady Vivian herself stood at the center of the garden path, attired in deep emerald silk that echoed the greenery around her. She was tall, elegant, and possessed a bearing that suggested she was accustomed to attention and well aware of how to command it. "Observe," she said, lifting a gloved hand toward the arrangement of topiary busts, faces shaped from living branches. It is as though nature herself stores the memories of all we feel, if we only know how to look. Beatrice Pym nodded. "They are expressions of emotion, Lady Harbury. The garden is like a diary, written in silence." "And read in silence," Sir Julian murmured, glass of champagne tilted beneath his lips. His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were cold and calculating, an expression that suggested he saw far more than he let on. Then, without warning, the air shifted. A sharp scream cut through the chatter, so sudden and piercing that all conversation halted at once. Miss Cora Finch was staring toward the far end of the garden, her hand trembling violently as she pointed. There, half hidden among the sculpted faces, stood the body of a woman. She leaned forward as though merely studying one of the leafy sculptures, but the posture was unnatural, her chin dipped far too low, her arms stretched stiffly before her. Her face was pale beneath the lamplight, and where her eyes should have been lively, perhaps curious or contemplative, they were instead wide with the unmistakable stare of death. It was Lady Vivian Harbury. Her body had already begun to cool. The shock rippled through the guests, yet each responded differently. Miss Finch collapsed into tears. Lucian ran forward, his voice breaking as he called his aunt's name. Mrs. Mullen clutched at Dr. Lenton's arm for support, though her expression was more intrigued than horrified. Dr. Lenton himself knelt to examine the body, his brow furrowing. Sir Julian merely watched, something unreadable flickering across his features. Beatrice Pym stepped backward, almost into one of the towering hedge faces, her expression tight with confusion, or was it fear? But even amid the chaos, there was no sign of violence. No blood, no wound, no shattered glass vial of poison, no fallen weapon. It appeared Lady Vivian had simply walked into her beloved garden and died. Yet something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her gloved right hand clutched a single object, a small folded piece of paper crushed tightly into her palm. Lucian reached to take it, but Dr. Lenton stopped him. No one must touch anything, not until the authorities have seen it. But the local constable was inexperienced, and murders, if one could call this a murder, were not common in Chilmorton Green. And so, by the following morning, a discreet telegram was dispatched to a very particular address in London, Whitehaven Mansions, residence of Monsieur Hercule Poirot. 2 days later, Hercule Poirot stood at the entrance to the garden, moustache immaculate, shoes polished to mirror shine, grey-green eyes surveying the estate with the intent precision of a jeweller examining a diamond. Beside him stood his old friend Captain Hastings, notebook in hand. "My dear Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice warm yet edged with keen attention, "already we have a scene most dramatic, a garden of faces that whisper secrets, a death without violence, and a gathering of persons, each one with their own sorrow, their own desire, their own fear. Très intéressant, very interesting indeed." "You think it was murder, then?" Hastings asked. Poirot's gaze drifted slowly across the rows of sculpted heads, their leafy eyes seeming to follow him. "My friend," he said softly, "there is one truth that is constant. When a person dies who should not die, it is rarely by chance." He took a step forward. "Besides, someone has already lied to us." Hastings blinked. "Lied? Who?" Poirot smiled, ever so slightly. "Ah, Hastings, let us first meet the players in our little drama, and then we shall listen to the garden whisper." Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings were shown into the morning room of Lady Harbury's estate, where the remaining guests of that fateful evening had been assembled. The atmosphere was one of suspended breath, conversations spoken just above whispers, eyes that darted to the door each time a step approached, and the heavy, pervasive tension of secrets not yet revealed. Poirot paused a moment before entering fully, his eye wandering over the decor. Lady Vivian had possessed exquisite taste. Paintings of serene pastoral scenes, pale sea-blue walls, and an assortment of delicate porcelain figurines arranged with precise balance. To disturb one would have been to upset the entire room's harmony. "Order," Poirot murmured softly to himself. She valued order. Hastings glanced toward him. "What was that?" Poirot only smiled. "An observation, mon ami. Nothing more. For now." They stepped forward, and the room stirred. Lucian Harbury was the first to approach, a young man of perhaps 27 with a well-cut suit that somehow failed to soften the disheveled air around him. His eyes were reddened, dark shadows beneath betraying a night with little sleep. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming," he said, though his tone held not gratitude, but strain. "The local constabulary is, well, they are not accustomed to handling matters of this sort." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, Monsieur Harbury. I understand Lady Vivian was your aunt." "Yes. She raised me after my parents died." The words should have carried warmth, yet there was something guarded, restrained, an affection spoken because propriety required it. She was a formidable woman. Poirot studied him for a beat longer than polite before nodding. "I shall hope to speak with you in more detail later." Lucian stepped back, shoulders tightening. Miss Cora Finch, Lady Vivian's live-in companion, stood near the window, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was a thin, bird-like woman with pale hair and nervous eyes that flickered constantly as though she were listening for sounds no one else could hear. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she began the moment he approached, voice trembling. I hardly know what to say. It was dreadful, simply dreadful. I'd only gone to fetch a wrap for Lady Harbury, When? Poirot raised a hand gently. Please, madame. We shall speak of the details soon. For the moment, be calm. I'm trying, she whispered, though her eyes shone with something beyond grief. Fear. A deep and personal fear. Hastings made a quiet note. Near the mantel stood Sir Julian Worthing and Mrs. Adelaide Mullen conversing in low voice. Sir Julian was a polished figure, handsome in a polished, almost sculpted way, with silvered temples and a posture suggesting years of careful self-composure. He looked at Poirot with a faintly amused expression, as though he found the situation troublesome, yet also faintly theatrical. Ah, Sir Julian said smoothly, the great Hercule Poirot. I've heard much of your exploits. You flatter me, Poirot replied. And yet, it is not my reputation that concerns us today. No, indeed, Sir Julian agreed, raising his glass. Not of champagne this time, but tea. A tragedy. Lady Harbury was a remarkable woman. Mrs. Mullen placed a hand upon her chest. And such a strange end. If only we understood what caused it. The doctor says no wound, no poison he could detect. A mystery, Monsieur Poirot. Quite the mystery. Poirot smiled politely. Most mysteries are less mysterious than they appear, madame. It is the psychology that gives difficulty, not the act. Sir Julian's eyes narrowed, a fraction too sharply for politeness. Psychology, you say? Always, Poirot replied, and moved on. Dr. Percival Lenton stood apart, reviewing a small notebook. He was a tall man, with thin spectacles and a habit of pressing his fingertips together as though weighing each idea before speaking. I examined the body shortly after discovery, he told Poirot in a calm, clinical voice. There was no sign of struggle or injury. No contusions, no discoloration, no scent of poison. The cause of death remains unclear. It could have been the heart. But Lady Harbury was in excellent health, Hastings interjected. Dr. Lenton's eyebrow lifted. Not all ailments are visible, Captain. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And yet, it is strange, is it not, for a woman to simply collapse among her beloved garden sculptures in the exact pose of contemplation, almost as though she expected to be discovered. Dr. Lenton hesitated. I cannot speak to that. No, Poirot said softly, but others can. Finally, there was Beatrice Pym, the sculptor of the topiary garden itself. She sat with her arms crossed protectively, her usually confident demeanor subdued. I made the faces to reflect emotion, she said, voice firm though low. Lady Harbury wanted each expression to represent a person she had known, someone who had influenced her. Some loved her, some wronged her. Ah, Poirot said quietly. So the garden is not merely art, it is memory. Beatrice looked up sharply. Yes, exactly that. And memory, mademoiselle, can be a dangerous thing. Her eyes flickered. Poirot stepped to the center of the room. My friends, he said, his tone gentle yet carrying unmistakable authority. Lady Vivian did not die without cause. Someone here knows more than they have said. It is only a matter of time before the truth is revealed. A hush settled. Dr. Lenton stiffened. Mrs. Mullen clutched her handkerchief. Sir Julian's smile remained calm, but his fingers tightened white around the handle of his teacup. And Lucienne Harbury looked away. Poirot bowed his head slightly. And now, I beg you, let us begin. End of part 2. The small study at the back of the Harbury estate had been selected for the interviews. The room, neatly kept and filled with shelves of travel journals and botanical volumes, overlooked the garden itself. Poirot insisted the curtains remain partially open. The topiary faces stared inward, as if eavesdropping. People speak differently when they believe they are being watched, Hastings, Poirot murmured. By shrubs? Hastings asked. Poirot gave a slight shrug of his shoulders. One must not underestimate the influence of atmosphere. He seated himself at the writing desk. Hastings took a chair nearby, pencil poised. "Let us begin," Poirot said quietly. "Miss Cora. Finch." Miss Finch entered hesitantly, clutching her handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the window, then down to the carpet. "Please sit, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "Tell me about Lady Harbury, your relationship with her." "Oh, she was very kind to me. Very kind indeed," Miss Finch said breathlessly. "I came to her 2 years ago, when I had nowhere else to go. She gave me employment, a home, a sense of purpose." "You were close then?" "Oh yes, though—" Miss Finch paused, lips trembling. She could be demanding, very exacting in her tastes. She liked things just so. "Order," Poirot murmured. "Yes, we observed that." Miss Finch nodded rapidly. "Yes, order in everything. The garden especially. She spent hours walking among those faces." Poirot leaned forward, eyes warm but intent. "Did Lady Harbury have any enemies?" Miss Finch flinched. The reaction was small, but Poirot saw it. "No, she was well liked," she said too quickly. Poirot did not press the obvious contradiction. Instead, "You discovered the body?" "Yes, I'd gone to fetch her shawl from the house. She said she felt a chill. When I returned, she... Her voice broke. Poirot allowed a moment of silence. "You are afraid," he said softly, not as accusation, but as truth. Miss Finch's eyes brimmed. "Yes, because I think Lady Harbury was frightened too. These past weeks, she received letters. She burned them before I could see. She said they were nothing, but she wasn't herself after." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Letters? From whom?" "I don't know, but they upset her. Terribly." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings as Miss Finch withdrew, trembling. "Sir Julian Worthing." Sir Julian entered with a composed air, hands folded behind his back, posture unshaken. He sat without being asked. "Your acquaintance with Lady Harbury," Poirot began. "Purely social," Sir Julian replied smoothly. "We shared philanthropic interests, the Village Restoration Fund, the Community Conservatory Project. She was a patron of the arts." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Yet you were among her guests last night." "Yes, I am a frequent guest here." He half smiled. Lady Harbury appreciated refined company. "You say refined, yet the soirée also included her nephew, who is rumored to have less refined habits." A flicker crossed Sir Julian's expression. "Lucien has troubles. Nothing more." "Debts." "That is hardly my concern, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot allowed a beat of silence. "You are a man who chooses his words with precision, I think." "Always." Sir Julian's smile returned. "And I say only this. Lady Harbury was an intelligent woman who took care to safeguard her affairs. Whatever happened to her was not the result of folly." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "Tell me, were you aware that Lady Harbury had been receiving distressing letters?" For the first time, Sir Julian's composure shifted. "Not much, but enough." "No, I was not aware." Poirot did not contradict him. Sir Julian stood. "If that is all." "For now," Poirot replied. Dr. Percival Lenton. The doctor was precise, measured. He sat with hands folded, gaze steady. "Doctor, you were familiar with Lady Harbury's medical condition." "She had no significant ailments," he replied. "Her health was excellent for a woman of her age." "And yet you proposed the cause of death might be the heart." "In absence of physical trauma, it is a reasonable assumption." "Unless," Poirot said delicately, "the method was one not easily detected." Dr. Lenton's fingers tightened fractionally. "Poison, you mean?" "Yes. There was no sign of poisoning. Poirot smiled faintly. Some poisons do not leave signs. Dr. Lenton's expression did not change, but something in the air sharpened. I am not an amateur, Monsieur Poirot. If there had been poison, I would have found it. Poirot inclined his head. Of course. But Hastings caught the shift. Dr. Lenton had answered too quickly. Beatrice Pym. The sculptor entered last, shoulders squared. Her hands bore faint cuts and scratches from head shears, marks of labor, not vanity. You created the garden, Poirot began. The faces, they are modeled on real people. Yes, Beatrice replied. Lady Harbury selected each expression. Some represent memory, some regret, some long-buried wounds. Wounds? Poirot repeated softly. Beatrice hesitated. Lady Harbury believed every human feeling leaves an imprint, and that we choose which impressions we keep. Poirot nodded, slowly. And did she keep anger? Beatrice's eyes darkened. Yes, she did. To whom was that anger directed? Beatrice took a breath. To someone who had not yet paid for what they did. Poirot looked toward the garden. The sculpted faces stood silent and still. And now, he said quietly, someone fears they will pay. As the door closed behind Beatrice, Hastings released a low breath. Well, Poirot, anything stand out? Poirot tapped a finger lightly on the desk. 5 conversations, Hastings, and in each one, a lie. He turned his gaze to the whispering garden outside. The truth, he murmured, is there, among them, waiting. The morning wore on, the sunlight shifting across the garden and the topiary faces. The estate was quiet, too quiet, each guest having retired to their rooms or the veranda, waiting under the silent weight of suspicion. Poirot, meanwhile, walked to the garden paths with measured steps, Hastings beside him, both men in thoughtful silence. The garden speaks, Hastings, Poirot said at last. Hastings gave the nearest shrub face a skeptical look. I can't say I hear anything myself. Poirot stopped beside one of the taller figures, a woman's face sculpted delicately from laurel, lips parted in an expression of frozen lament. No, not with the ears, but with the mind. Each of these faces was chosen to represent a memory or a sentiment. Lady Harbury intended them as confessions in greenery. I must say, Hastings muttered, I prefer confessions in writing. Poirot gave a small laugh. Yes, mon ami, you are wonderfully straightforward, but human beings, rarely so. Before Hastings could reply, footsteps sounded along the gravel path. Lucian Harbury approached, his face pale and strained, his movements sharp with jittered energy. He halted before Poirot and Hastings with an abruptness that made the hedge faces seem to lean closer. Monsieur Poirot, Lucien began, voice low and tight, I must speak with you, privately. Poirot nodded once. But of course. Captain Hastings, if you would. Hastings stepped away, though he remained close enough to observe from a respectful distance. Lucien took a deep breath, hands fisting in his jacket pockets. You must understand. I cared for my aunt. I did. But she was not always kind. She controlled everything, my allowance, my living situation, even the guests I could socialize with. She believed she was shaping me into a responsible man. Instead, she made my life intolerable. Poirot watched him with calm interest. You were dependent upon her financially? Lucien nodded. Entirely. And recently she threatened to alter her will, to cut me out. Did she tell you why? Poirot asked. Lucien's jaw worked. She said I had disappointed her once too often, that I lacked integrity. Poirot tilted his head. And do you? Lucien's gaze flickered, but held. I have debts. Yes, but I would never harm her. He swallowed, then spoke again, the words quick and urgent. "But I know who might have." "Sir Julian." Poirot raised a brow. "Ah? Go on." "Sir Julian is not what he seems," Lucien insisted. "He's charming, yes, but he is also calculating. He was very close to my aunt. Too close. He knew she was wealthy, and I believe he intended to marry her." Poirot did not speak. Lucien continued, growing more animated. "My aunt trusted him. They took walks in this very garden. They spoke privately. She sought his advice on finances, but she began to see through him, perhaps only recently. They argued the night before her death. I heard them." Poirot nodded slowly. "What was said?" Lucien hesitated, then, "I heard my aunt say, 'I will not be manipulated.'" And Sir Julian replied, coldly, "We shall see." There it was. Motive. At least enough for a suspicion. Poirot thanked Lucien gently and dismissed him. As soon as Lucien left, Hastings returned at once. "Well?" Hastings asked. "Do you believe him?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing the path. "Lucien Harbury is a man who fears much: poverty, loss of status, perhaps guilt of some kind. But that does not make him a liar. Nor does it make him truthful." "But the quarrel?" Hastings pressed. "That seems significant." "Yes, a quarrel is always significant, but a quarrel heard second-hand. That is something different." They found Sir Julian in the library, standing beside an open window overlooking the garden. He turned as they entered, expression composed as though awaiting them. "Have you come to accuse me, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked lightly. Poirot smiled. "Not at all. I have simply come to inquire." Sir Julian's gaze sharpened, but he gestured for them to sit. "Then inquire." Poirot began gently, but with unmistakable precision. "It is said that you and Lady Harbury had an emotional closeness, perhaps one that might lead to marriage." Sir Julian blinked. "Once," then smiled. "Ah, so that is the rumor being passed. Let me be clear. Lady Harbury and I shared intellectual interests and mutual respect. Nothing more. No romantic intentions?" "None," Sir Julian said firmly. "I'm fond of companionship, but I have no interest in matrimony. My late wife was a remarkable woman. I would not seek to replace her." Poirot observed him closely. Posture relaxed, gaze steady, tone calm. Too calm, perhaps. "And yet," Poirot continued, "you argued with Lady Harbury the night before her death." Sir Julian's jaw did not tighten. Rather, it loosened, relieved. "Yes, that is true," he said simply. Hastings started in surprise. "I advised her," Sir Julian continued, "to show more trust toward her nephew. She believed Lucien weak, suggested he was simply lost. She did not appreciate my perspective." Poirot nodded. "You disagreed on his future, then? Nothing more?" Sir Julian held his gaze. "Nothing more." And Poirot believed him, not because the explanation was convincing, but because it was not polished enough to be a lie. When they stepped back into the hall, Hastings spoke immediately. "So that's a dead end, then?" Poirot lifted a finger. "No. A false path, but not without purpose. When you find a false lead, Hastings, you must ask who benefits from it." "Someone wants us to suspect Sir Julian?" Poirot nodded. "And someone, mon ami," he said softly, "is extremely afraid." The afternoon sun had grown mellow by the time Poirot and Hastings re-entered the drawing-room, where tea had been laid out with careful propriety. Yet no one touched it. The cups sat untouched, the silver spoons gleaming and silent. The guests were gathered again, each person in their own quiet orbit of anxiety. Poirot stood by the hearth, hands gently clasped behind his back, eyes drifting across each face with serene patience. But beneath that calm lay sharpness, purpose, calculation. "Before we proceed," Poirot said pleasantly, I should like to make an announcement." Every head lifted, every breath held. There has been much talk of Lady Harbury's sudden collapse. It is natural to consider illness, shock, the frailty of the heart. But, his voice softened, I do not believe Lady Harbury died a natural death. A ripple ran through the room like a chill draught through the walls. Mrs. Mullen gasped, hand flying to her chest. Miss Finch trembled violently. Lucian stared at the floor. Sir Julian's eyes narrowed, though his face remained calm. Dr. Lenton slowly moved his hands from behind his back to fold before him, controlled. Beatrice Pym did not move at all. "Yes," Poirot continued, "I am convinced that Lady Harbury was murdered." Hastings watched the reactions closely, every twitch, every flinch, every forced stillness. Poirot had chosen to make the declaration here, among all of them, for one reason. Guilt reveals itself under pressure. Poirot began to pace slowly, gently. "You see, there is a detail that our murderer believed insignificant, a detail so small that it escapes the notice of those who look only at the surface." Sir Julian spoke first. "And this detail is—" Poirot smiled mildly. "Patience, monsieur. In time." His eyes shifted to Miss Finch. "Mademoiselle Finch, would you do us the kindness of describing once more how you found the body?" Miss Finch's breath hitched. I had gone to fetch Lady Harbury's shawl. When I returned, she was standing in the garden, leaning forward as though examining one of the topiary faces. But then I saw her eyes. They were wrong, staring. I screamed. "You did not touch her?" Poirot asked. No, I was too frightened." Poirot nodded. "And was anyone else in the garden when you returned?" No, I didn't see anyone." But the tone was different now, thin, uncertain. Poirot turned his head slowly toward Sir Julian. "And you, monsieur? Where were you at the same time?" Sir Julian did not flinch. "On the veranda, speaking with Mrs. Mullen and Dr. Lenton." Mrs. Mullen nodded immediately, too quickly. Yes, he was." Poirot gave a gentle nod. "Of course." Then he looked to Lucien. "And you, monsieur?" Lucien's eyes flickered. "I was in the billiards room, alone." Alone. Always inconvenient, the alibi without witness. Poirot let silence linger before speaking again. Softly, almost tenderly. "You see how delicate the matters of truth and timing become. Each of you was near. Each of you had access. And each of you, I think, has a reason to fear something being revealed." The guests stiffened. Poirot leaned down to gently lift a small porcelain figure from the mantel, a shepherdess with a shy, painted smile. "One must understand the psychology," he said quietly. "A murderer is not always the most obvious suspect, nor the most villainous in character. Sometimes the murderer is the one who fears the loss of control, or the revealing of a secret, or the return of a past wrong." The porcelain shepherdess was placed down again, exactly where it had been, aligned with perfect symmetry. Then Poirot's gaze shifted to Beatrice Pym. "You knew Lady Harbury's secrets better than most, did you not?" Beatrice did not look away. Her voice was steady. "She confided in me, yes, but that does not make me a murderer." "No," Poirot said gently. "It does not. But it makes you a keeper of truth. And truth is a very dangerous thing." Sir Julian's voice cut in, low and sharp. "What is the point of this, Monsieur Poirot? You seem eager to unsettle us, but you've named no culprit." Poirot's smile widened, not with warmth, but with understanding. "Ah, but I have." Breaths caught, eyes widened. Poirot raised a hand. "But I shall not say the name now. For if the murderer believes I know everything, they will retreat into silence. But if they believe I know only part," he lifted a finger, "they will make a mistake." The air thickened with tension. Hastings felt it tighten like a drawn wire. Poirot looked slowly around the room. "And so, I shall continue my investigation, quietly, carefully. And while I do, our murderer, they will show themselves. They already tremble. He turned to leave the room. Behind him, someone exhaled too sharply. Someone else clasped their hands to stop them shaking. Someone stared fixedly at the floor as if afraid to meet the eyes of anyone present. Poirot paused at the doorway, speaking without turning back. Remember, mes amis, the truth is like a seed planted in the earth. It may be hidden for a time, but eventually it grows. Then he stepped out, Hastings following. Once they were alone in the corridor, Hastings whispered urgently, "You know who did it?" Poirot smiled. "No, Hastings. I know who is afraid that I know. And that, mon ami, is the first step to truth." The evening light hung low over chill Morton Green, stretching the shadows of the garden into long, reaching silhouettes. The estate had grown oppressively quiet. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Something hung in the air, something unspoken, heavy, waiting. Poirot had excused himself after the dramatic gathering, claiming a need for rest, though Hastings suspected his friend was not resting at all. And indeed, Poirot stood now on the veranda, gazing toward the garden, the soft flutter of curtains behind him the only sound. He spoke quietly, almost to the air itself. Someone believes themselves watched, and fear, Hastings. Fear leads always to action. Hastings frowned. But what action? With everyone practically hovering under each other's noses? Poirot lifted a hand. Patience. The murderer will move again. If they believe there is evidence remaining, something that could expose them, they will try to remove it. Before Hastings could respond, a sudden sharp cry split the air. A woman's voice, high, terrified. Poirot and Hastings rushed toward it at once. The cry had come from the garden. They ran through the archway of climbing roses, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The topiary faces loomed larger in the deepening twilight, their green expressions strangely alive in the half-light. Near the center of the garden, by the statue-like bust of a man with a sorrowfully downturned mouth, Miss Cora Finch stood trembling violently, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing at the ground. There, beside her, lay a smashed porcelain cup. Hastings blinked. A cup? That's what she screamed over? But Poirot did not dismiss it. No, someone startled her, or someone fled. Poirot knelt beside the broken pieces. Just beside the fragments, the earth was disturbed, a footprint, messy, hurried, more of a scrape than a step. The grass nearby bent, not trodden, but crushed as though under sudden weight. Poirot stood slowly. Someone came here. Recently. Very recently. Miss Finch stammered. I came to the garden to clear my head. I heard something, rustling like someone moving among the topiary. I called out, but no one answered. And then I felt someone near me, close enough to touch, but I turned and there was no one. And then the cup fell. She burst into tears. Poirot rested a hand lightly on her arm. "It is quite all right, mademoiselle. You're safe." But Hastings noticed something Poirot already had. Miss Finch was shaking too violently for it to be merely shock. She was terrified of something more than just the garden. Poirot led her back toward the house. But he stopped, mid-step. The folded slip of paper, still in Lady Harbury's lifeless hand. Poirot had deliberately left it untouched for the local inspector to witness. The inspector, overwhelmed and inexperienced, had sealed it unread and returned it to Poirot earlier that day. Poirot now held the envelope in his coat pocket. He removed it carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were not. "You cannot keep me buried in the garden. I will return. Truth grows where memory is planted. Do not forget the name. SF." Hastings exhaled sharply. SF. Someone with those initials. Someone who knew her. Someone who wanted her frightened. Poirot nodded. And someone who succeeded. Miss Finch, hearing the word frightened, shivered visibly and turned her face away. Later that evening, after Miss Finch had been escorted to her room, Poirot gathered the remaining guests in the drawing-room once more. He stood before the window, the garden reflected dimly behind him. "My friends," he said, voice low but clear, "the letter Lady Harbury received before her death suggests a connection to the garden itself. Someone believed she had hidden something among the topiary faces, something they desired to either destroy or reclaim." Sir Julian's brow furrowed. "Hidden? In plants? Perhaps not something physical," Poirot replied. "Perhaps something remembered." Mrs. Mullen leaned forward, whispering, "A secret?" Poirot did not answer directly. He looked instead to Dr. Lenton, whose face had gone rigid and still. Too still. "You are very insistent, Doctor," Poirot said quietly, "that Lady Harbury's death was natural. Such certainty is interesting, especially when you had very little evidence." Dr. Lenton's jaw tightened. "I merely stated what appeared obvious." Poirot moved his gaze to Lucien. "And you, monsieur, were most concerned with ensuring we suspected another." Lucien opened his mouth, but no words came. Then Poirot's eyes rested on Beatrice Pym. "And you, mademoiselle, spoke of memory and wounds, of those Lady Harbury chose to carve into the garden." Beatrice swallowed once, but remained composed. "So," Poirot continued softly, "it seems to me that the next step is clear. We must examine the garden thoroughly, not just the surface, but beneath." Lucien blanched. Beatrice looked away. Mrs. Mullen gasped. Sir Julian's face remained unreadable. Only Dr. Lenton spoke. "Digging up the garden," he said sharply, "is an insult to Lady Harbury's legacy." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, but murder, Doctor, that is a greater insult still." Outside, the wind stirred the topiary faces, and the leaves rustled like faint whispering voices. The garden had begun to speak, and soon it would tell everything. The next morning dawned grey and wind-stirred, the sky thick with cloud. It seemed even the weather was uneasy. Hastings awoke to find Poirot already dressed immaculately, his moustache perfectly waxed, his shoes immaculate as though not a fleck of dust had ever dared touch them. "You slept lightly, Hastings?" Poirot asked as they stepped into the corridor. "I should say so. Hard to sleep in a house where one might be living with a murderer." Poirot nodded. "Quite so. The murderer, Hastings, is becoming desperate, and desperation makes one careless. Today, we look for what they fear most." They walked out into the garden, where the topiary figures awaited like silent jurors. The guests assembled slowly, some reluctantly, others with outward calm that did not quite reach their eyes. Sir Julian stood with hands behind his back, face composed but distant. Mrs. Mullen draped herself in a shawl, eyes darting nervously. Lucien looked pale, his hands clenched in his coat pockets. Miss Finch hovered near the veranda door, fear wrapped around her like a cloak. Dr. Lenton watched them all, face unreadable, and Beatrice Pym stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the garden, not the people. Poirot addressed them all. "Lady Harbury kept secrets here," he said softly. "And secrets do not vanish simply because one wishes them hidden. They take root." He motioned toward one of the larger topiary sculptures, a stern-faced man with coarse, furrowed brows and a grim, unsmiling mouth. "This," Beatrice said quietly before anyone questioned, "is the judge. Lady Harbury insisted upon him. She said it reminded her of someone." Poirot nodded. Someone who wronged her, perhaps. Someone she wished to confront, even symbolically. No one spoke. Poirot turned toward Beatrice. You recall, mademoiselle, the placement of each topiary, the order of their creation. Yes, she replied. Each was added year by year. Then this one, Poirot said, touching the trimmed laurel leaf of the judge's brow, was not among the first. No, it was one of the most recent. Poirot smiled. Just so. He crouched and gestured for Hastings. A spade, if you please. Lucien stepped forward at once. Wait, what do you intend? You mean to dig up the garden? Her garden? Poirot looked at him gently. Only the roots tell the truth, monsieur. Lucien opened his mouth to protest, but Dr. Lenton placed a hand on his arm. Let him, the doctor said. Let the truth come. Lucien's eyes flickered. Fearful. That fear did not go unnoticed. Hastings fetched the spade, and together he and Poirot began to loosen the soil around the base of the topiary. The others watched, some tense, others rigid, a few practically frozen. The earth was soft at first, then harder. Then Poirot stopped. There, he murmured. Hastings knelt, beside him, brushing soil aside with care. A shape emerged, darkened by time but unmistakably fabric. Poirot lifted it free, a strip of cloth, pale once, now earth-stained. A torn scrap from a dress or scarf. Miss Finch gasped. That looks like— Yes, Poirot said gently. It appears to match the fabric of Lady Harbury's shawl. Lucien's jaw dropped open. But how did that get buried here? Poirot did not answer him. Instead, he continued digging. A small wooden box, weathered, no larger than a jewelry case, lay nestled deep beneath the roots. Poirot brushed the soil gently away and lifted the box with both hands. Reverent and deliberate, the guests leaned forward as though drawn on strings. Poirot opened it. Inside lay a lock of pale hair, tied neatly with ribbon, a small gold ring, and a faded photograph of a woman, Lady Harbury, arms wrapped around a younger woman nearly her mirror, save for the softer expression in her eyes. The back of the photograph bore a name, Sybil, and a date, 20 years past. Hastings inhaled sharply. Good heavens, Lady Harbury had a sister. Beatrice nodded. Yes, Sybil Finch. She was Miss Cora's elder sister. Every head turned to Miss Finch. She looked as if her heart had stopped beating. Poirot spoke softly, gently. Mademoiselle Finch. Lady Harbury did not take you in merely out of charity. You were the last living link to her beloved sister. Tears welled and spilled over Miss Finch's cheeks. She told me not to speak of Sybil, that she wished the past to sleep. Poirot bowed his head. The past, mademoiselle, does not sleep merely because one closes their eyes to it. Sir Julian's voice broke in, voice low. So the initials, SF, stand for Sybil Finch. The letters were not a threat from someone living, but a memory, a wound. No, Poirot corrected softly. The writer knew the wound. Someone used Sybil's memory to torment Lady Harbury. He looked slowly, deliberately around the circle. And that someone is here. Dr. Lenton stiffened. Lucien swallowed. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Miss Finch sobbed quietly. Sir Julian exhaled. Mrs. Mullen clutched her shawl. Poirot closed the box. This garden was a monument to grief, to guilt, to love and suffering entwined. His voice lowered. But someone believed Lady Harbury had wronged them, and they believed the garden held the key to correcting that wrong. Hastings whispered, Poirot. The murderer wasn't trying to destroy a garden. They were trying to bury the past. Poirot nodded. Yes, Hastings, and now that past is no longer buried. He turned to the group, and so the murderer must act again. Soon. Every face paled, every leaf in the garden rustled, as though the garden whispered, be unmasked. The box containing Sybil Finch's keepsakes remained on the table in the drawing room, its presence like a quiet accusation, The photograph, the ring, the lock of hair, each a fragment of a life cut short. Lady Harbury had guarded these mementos with devotion, and someone had sought to use that devotion against her. The guests were subdued, their conversations hushed. No longer did they feign polite composure. Each carried strain in their posture, their movements taut with restrained anxiety. Poirot stood near the window, hands lightly clasped behind his back. Hastings noted how still he was. Not a man uncertain, nor a man waiting, but one who watched carefully, like a strategist awaiting a shift in the battlefield. "Poirot," Hastings murmured. "This revelation, Sybil Finch, what exactly does it change?" "Everything," Poirot replied softly. Lady Harbury's final weeks were governed not by fear of the future, but by memory of the past, and that memory was placed before her deliberately. "You think someone wanted to torment her?" Poirot nodded once. "Oui. To torment, and then to silence." Hastings frowned. Then whoever wrote the letters knew Sybil personally. Poirot's gaze moved to the room's occupants, each lost in their own thoughts. "Or," he corrected gently, "knew of her story. One need not love the ghost to wield it as a knife." Later that afternoon, Poirot called each person to walk the garden with him privately, not to interrogate, but simply to observe how each moved among the silent, leafy faces. For Poirot believed wholeheartedly that guilt does not live in the mind alone. It lives in posture, in hesitation, in where the eyes choose not to look. Sir Julian Worthing. He walked with Zoll-like poise, hands behind his back, gaze straight forward rather than evasive. His voice remained calm. "Are you satisfied that I have no part in this tragedy?" Poirot did not answer the question directly. "You respected Lady Harbury, monsieur. That much is clear, but respect does not preclude secrets." Sir Julian's step faltered, only faintly. "We all have secrets, Poirot." "Yes," Poirot murmured, "but some secrets do harm only to oneself. Others harm others." Sir Julian did not respond. Poirot took note. Mrs. Adelaide Mullen. She clung to Poirot's arm as they walked, her voice hushed and trembling. "I cannot bear this suspense, Monsieur Poirot. The thought that the murderer walks among us. I cannot sleep, I cannot think." Poirot studied her closely. "Madame, grief is exhausting, but fear is corrosive." "What do you fear?" Mrs. Mullen blinked rapidly. I fear being wrong, or worse, being right." Poirot's brows lifted, but he did not press. The woman was overwrought, yes, but not insincere. Fear clung to her, but not the fear of guilt. The fear of truth. Lucian Harbury. Lucian's steps were restless, his fingers twitching. He avoided looking at the topiary faces, as though the expressions judged him. "My aunt was going to change her will," he muttered. "She didn't tell me outright, but I could tell. I know everyone thinks I cared about the money, but I cared about her. She was my family." Poirot walked beside him in silence. Lucien's voice lowered. If she was murdered, it was because someone wanted to hurt her, or her memory, or what she stood for. Poirot stopped walking. "You speak as though you know what precisely that was." Lucien's face tightened. She protected our name, our reputation. All of it came from Sybil's death. Lady Harbury told me that once, that the family was built over grief." Poirot's eyes glinted. He had expected Lucien to know more than he claimed. Dr. Percival Lenton. They walked along the narrow path leading toward the willow hedge. Dr. Lenton's pace was measured, his face composed. "The box," Poirot said. "Did you know of its existence?" The doctor's gaze did not shift. "I knew Lady Harbury had been deeply affected by her sister's passing, but I knew nothing of private keepsakes buried in the garden. You were the first to pronounce death, Poirot observed softly. You insisted on natural causes. Because that was my medical judgment, Lenton replied sharply, too sharply. Poirot paused beside him, voice barely audible. Doctor? Some poisons leave no trace on the body, but they do leave traces in behavior. Agitation, weakness, a faltering of breath. Lady Harbury displayed these in the final fortnight. You saw this? Yes. Silence, just for a beat. Then Dr. Lenton said quietly, grief affects the body. A correct answer, and a carefully safe one. Poirot simply smiled. Beatrice Pym. She walked quietly, her steps slow, her eyes travelling from sculpture to sculpture with something like mourning. I created these shapes from Lady Harbury's memories, she said softly. But I feared that the garden would swallow her, that she would begin to live in the past entirely. You cared for her, Poirot said gently. Yes, she believed in me when I was no one. Poirot nodded. And yet, mademoiselle, belief is not the same as truth. Did she ever tell you how Sybil died? Beatrice stopped walking. No, she whispered. She would not speak of it. Poirot looked at her. Then someone else did. Her eyes widened, not in guilt, but realization. After the final private walk, Poirot and Hastings stood again before the garden. Well? Hastings asked. What do you see? Poirot's voice was soft, thoughtful. I see a pattern, a tightening of threads. Someone lied today, Hastings, and badly, not about crime, but about emotion. Hastings blinked. Emotion, Poirot nodded. For the truth is not in facts alone, it is in what one fears to feel, and someone here fears Sybil Finch. Not her life, her memory. The wind stirred the leaves of the topiary faces. The expressions seemed to ripple, as though whispering among themselves. Poirot turned toward the house. Tonight, he said, we set the trap. Night returned to the Harbury estate with a slow, creeping quiet. The garden lay in shadow, the topiary faces looming like mute witnesses beneath the faint moonlight. A storm was collecting in the distant sky. The air hummed with approaching thunder. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Poirot's trap, subtle, psychological, precise, had already been set in motion. He had spoken just loudly enough at dinner to be overheard by every guest. Tomorrow morning, I will reveal the key that proves Lady Harbury's death was not natural. The truth lies not in the garden itself, but in who sought to hide their connection to Sybil Finch. Nothing more, nothing less. The result was immediate and unmistakable. Lucian had nearly dropped his wine-glass. Miss Cora Finch had gone pale as linen. Dr. Lenton had blinked once, too slowly. Beatrice Pym closed her eyes as though bracing herself for a tide. Mrs. Mullen's hands shook. Sir Julian alone remained composed, but even he had spoken less than usual. Poirot was not looking for confession. He was looking for fear. Fear always moves. Fear always acts. Later that night, when the grandfather clock struck 11, Poirot and Hastings sat in the dimly lit study, curtains drawn back so they could see the garden through the darkened glass. "Do you think the murderer truly believes you have the proof?" Hastings whispered. Poirot smiled faintly. "I have no proof at all, but I said enough to suggest I do. The murderer will not risk what they believe I may reveal." Hastings stared. "You mean someone will try to destroy evidence?" Poirot lifted a finger, "Or silence the one who holds it." Thunder rumbled faintly. Hastings felt a chill crawl down his arms. "Poirot, you don't mean they will come for you?" Poirot's smile only widened. Gently, knowingly. "No, Hastings. Not for me." His eyes shifted toward the garden. "They will return to the place where the truth was buried." Minutes passed, then footsteps. Soft, hesitant. Poirot motioned for silence. They stepped into the garden just as the clouds swallowed the moon, the darkness deep as ink. The figure ahead did not see them. Cloaked in a dark coat, their posture rigid, they moved swiftly toward the topiary known as the judge, the very place the box had been uncovered. The figure knelt. Hands moved quickly, digging, searching. Hastings whispered, "They're trying to find something. Something we didn't take." Poirot nodded. "Yes, something they fear might still be there." They stepped closer. A branch snapped softly under Hastings' shoe. The kneeling figure froze, then rose. Turning, lightning flared across the sky, illuminating the garden with harsh white light. Miss Cora Finch stood before them. Her face was ashen, streaked with tears, hair clinging damp to her temples. Hastings let out a stunned breath. "Miss Finch, you—" "No," she choked. "No, please, listen. I didn't kill her. I didn't, but I knew. I knew what killed her." Poirot stepped closer, voice quiet, steady. "Then tell us, mademoiselle." Cora's hands trembled violently. My sister, Sybil, she didn't die of illness. She died because of him." Her hand shot out, shaking toward Dr. Lenton, who had appeared at the veranda doors, drawn by the commotion. Thunder cracked. Cora's voice rose, ragged, desperate. "He took her into his care, physician, caretaker, liar, and when she began to recover, when she found reason to live again, he told her she was hopeless. He made her believe life was over. And she took her own life." A collective gasp broke from the group now spilling into the garden. Dr. Lenton did not move. Hastings stared. "Good Lord!" Poirot's voice was soft, but carried unmistakable authority. And Lady Harbury knew. Dr. Lenton's voice emerged at last. Quiet, cold. "She believed she could ruin me. She believed her grief gave her right to condemn. She was going to reveal it, publicly. Destroy my career, my reputation, my life." Poirot nodded once, slowly. "So you poisoned her?" Dr. Lenton laughed. Not loud, not wild, just hollow. "I gave her something to ease nerves, to make her calm, a sedative, one she had taken before, one that, in higher dosage, stops the breath. Quietly, painlessly. She did not even know." He closed his eyes. "She died thinking only of her sister." Lightning cracked the sky again. The truth was out, not shouted, not fought, simply spoken. Because sometimes murder is not rage, but belief. Misguided, deluded, absolute. Miss Finch fell to her knees in the wet grass, sobbing, not for Lady Harbury alone, but for a sister long gone. A wound reopened. Hastings crossed himself. Poirot stepped forward, calm as ever, though his eyes glimmered, not with triumph, but sorrow. "Dr. Lenton," he said gently, "it is time." The doctor did not resist as he was led away. The wind stirred the garden leaves again. The whispering faces were silent, not accusing, not mourning, simply still. The past had been unearthed, the truth had grown, and now only the reveal remained. The drawing room was lit with soft lamplight, though the storm continued to prowl outside, rumbling like distant artillery. The household had assembled once more, not by invitation, but by inevitability. A servant had contacted the local constable, who would arrive shortly. Until then, the room felt suspended in a breath that had not yet been released. Dr. Percival Lenton sat nearest the window, his hands folded neatly in his lap. There was no fight in him now, only the calm of a man who had already confessed to himself long before he spoke it aloud. Miss Cora Finch sat on the edge of the sofa, trembling, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Lucian stood behind her as though guarding something fragile. Sir Julian and Mrs. Mullen kept discreet distance, each watching the doctor with wary fascination. Beatrice Pym remained standing, arms crossed, eyes lowered, not in guilt, but grief. Poirot stood before the fireplace, its flame low and flickering. Hastings beside him, note still in hand, although the case no longer required documentation. "My friends," Poirot began quietly, "you have seen the truth unfold, but perhaps not yet the full shape of it. Murder, yes, but murder rarely springs fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. No, murder grows from soil long prepared." He gestured toward Miss Finch. Lady Harbury's sister, Sybil Finch, was a woman of great sensitivity. She suffered a deep melancholy. Dr. Lenton was her physician and confidant. Poirot turned his gaze to the doctor. "You believed you understood despair, did you not? You believed you could control it?" Dr. Lenton's expression did not change. "I believed intervention could be futile when the patient refuses life." "No, doctor," Poirot replied softly. "You believed you were the arbiter of who should fight and who should surrender, a god in a white coat." A faint shiver moved among the room. Poirot continued, "Sybil confided in you. She entrusted you with her suffering, and instead of bolstering her spirit, you fed her hopelessness under the guise of compassion. When she ended her own life, Lady Harbury discovered the truth, but too late." Beatrice closed her eyes. "Yes," Poirot said, his voice gentle but unflinching. "Lady Harbury buried her grief. She built this garden as a monument to memory. But wounds do not stay silent forever. Someone who resented Lady Harbury's power, began sending letters invoking Sybil's name." He turned toward Miss Finch. Mademoiselle Finch believed these letters were from a stranger, but it was not so. The handwriting, the turns of phrase, belonged to someone who knew Sybil's final weeks intimately. His gaze returned to Dr. Lenton. "You, doctor, sought to break Lady Harbury's composure, to remind her of her grief, to make her afraid." Dr. Lenton spoke at last, voice low, controlled. "She intended to ruin me, my practice, my name, my work. I could not allow it. If she had told the village what she believed, whether true or not, my life would have been over." "And so," Poirot said softly, "you chose to end hers." Lucien exhaled a harsh breath. Grief and rage tangled together. "You killed her over reputation." Dr. Lenton's gaze did not waver. "A physician's name is his life." Poirot nodded once, emotion not of agreement but understanding the logic. "And the manner of the murder," Poirot continued, "was elegant, quiet. A simple increase in dosage of a sedative Lady Harbury already took on occasion. No visible mark, no dramatic symptoms. The body simply ceased." The room was utterly still. Poirot looked to Miss Finch, voice gentle now. Mademoiselle Cora was not the murderer. She was the one who bore the grief second-hand. She guessed, but did not act. Her silence was fear, not guilt. Miss Finch broke down, sobbing softly. Poirot stepped toward her and rested a kind hand upon her shoulder. "Your grief is real. It does you credit." She nodded through tears. The sound of carriage wheels approached outside. The constable arriving, Dr. Lenton rose. Not with desperation, not resistance, acceptance. "Shall we?" he asked quietly. Poirot nodded. As the constable entered, Poirot spoke softly to the doctor. "There is always a choice, doctor, even at the very end." Dr. Lenton gave a tired half-smile. "Is there, Monsieur Poirot? Truly?" Poirot did not answer. The doctor was led away into the storm-damp dark. The room remained quiet long after he was gone. Hastings finally spoke. "I don't suppose I shall ever understand how someone so calm could be capable of something so terrible." Poirot looked into the fire. "It is often the calm souls, Hastings, who carry storms inside. To them, Logic becomes justification, and the heart is silenced long before the crime is committed. Poirot turned to the group, offering a slight bow, full of dignity and, yes, sadness. The affair is concluded. Lady Harbury may rest in peace, and the whispers in the garden will quiet now. Beatrice lifted her head. "Will you have the garden removed?" Poirot shook his head. "No, let it remain. Let memory stand, not in torment, but in remembrance. Grief is not to be buried. It is to be tended." The storm broke softly outside, gentle rain falling across the sculpted faces in the garden, washing, soothing, returning everything to silence. The morning after the arrest dawned clear and golden, as though the previous night's storm had swept away not only the clouds, but some invisible veil that had hung over the Harbury estate. Sunlight spilled across the garden, illuminating each topiary face with a warmth that had been absent before. The whispers that once rustled through the garden now seemed to hush themselves into peace. Poirot and Hastings stood near the veranda, awaiting their carriage. The house behind them was quiet, though not empty of life. Rather, it felt as if it were breathing again after a long-held breath. Hastings adjusted his hat and glanced toward the garden. "Hard to believe," he murmured, "that all this beauty was tied to such sorrow." Poirot nodded, though his eyes were focused on the sculpted figures, the judge, the laughing child, the woman in sorrow, the silent man, each one shaped from memory and pain. "Beauty, Hastings," Poirot said softly, "is very often born from sorrow, and sorrow from love." Hastings blinked, thoughtful. "I suppose Lady Harbury loved her sister very much." Poirot's expression softened, more than she could bear, and grief, when not spoken, when sealed inside, becomes a prison. Lady Harbury tried to transform her sorrow into art, into remembrance, but the wound was never healed, only hidden. He stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly across the leaves of the judge. "She tried to forgive," he murmured. "But forgiveness requires truth, and truth was what she lacked until the very end." Hastings frowned. "Do you believe Dr. Lenton meant to drive Sybil to her death? Or was he simply monstrous in his arrogance?" Poirot exhaled slowly, his moustache lowering in shadowed contemplation. "There are crimes, Hastings, that are born from passion, rage, jealousy, fear, and then there are crimes born from the cold intellect, from the belief that one knows better than all others. These," his voice dropped, "are the most dangerous crimes of all. Because the murderer convinces himself it is necessary," Hastings said quietly. "Just so," Poirot replied. "Dr. Lenton believed he was sparing Sybil further suffering, and when Lady Harbury threatened the reputation he had built, he believed again that the end justified the means." Hastings shook his head. "A terrible thing, pride." Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "The greatest tragedies, mon ami, are not caused by evil hearts, but by hearts that believe themselves righteous." Miss Cora Finch emerged from the house then, wrapped in a soft shawl. Her steps were hesitant, like a bird released after being long caged. Her eyes were red, but clearer now. She paused when she reached them. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you." Poirot bowed with gentle grace. "There is no need to thank me, mademoiselle. The truth was already here. I merely listened." She clasped her hands. "I have spent my life being frightened. First for my sister, then for myself, then of the memories. I don't know how to live differently." Poirot's gaze was warm but steady. "You begin, mademoiselle, by planting something new. Grief is a root that burrows deep, but even deep roots can give rise to new blossoms." Her eyes filled, but she smiled. "I think perhaps I shall remain here, in the garden, not to hide, but to remember." Poirot nodded. "Then Lady Harbury has left her legacy in good hands. Miss Finch bowed her head, and Poirot and Hastings stepped away, allowing her to walk among the quietly shining leaves. She paused before the judge and laid her hand upon its bow, her figure small but not weak. Hastings exhaled. "She'll be all right." "Yes," Poirot said softly. "She will." Beatrice Pym approached next, a pair of gloves tucked into her belt, her eyes thoughtful. "I will tend the garden," she said without prompting, "but I will not reshape the faces. Not even the judge. They must remain as they are." Poirot smiled. "You understand, mademoiselle. A garden is not for forgetting. It is for remembering without drowning." Beatrice nodded. Lady Harbury wanted the garden to speak. Now, it will speak truth. Poirot bowed slightly. She returned the gesture, then walked toward Miss Finch. Two women bound not by tragedy alone, but by the act of facing it. Finally, Lucien approached, not nervously now, but with quiet resolve. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I loved her. I only wish I'd understood her better." Poirot placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then honor her memory by living with integrity, monsieur. Not because she demanded it, because it is the only life that allows peace." Lucien nodded, and for the first time, he seemed to stand correctly in his own skin. The carriage arrived. Hastings climbed in first. Poirot paused once more to gaze at the garden. The sun caught on the trimmed leaves, making the topiary faces seem as though they were exhaling. "Do you hear it, Hastings?" Poirot asked quietly. "Hear what?" Poirot smiled. Not whispering now, only silence, the silence of peace. He stepped into the carriage. The horses began to move. The estate receded behind them, and the garden, once heavy with secrets, now rested beneath open sky.